Hi, it's Dan, and you're watching the Salty Sea. I'm here today with another Warcry faction rundown, this time for Khorne Bloodbound, aka the humans who are worshipping the blood god. Now, if you've played Games Workshop games before, you know the deal. If not, then Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows. He's the meanest and most over-the-top of the Chaos Gods, and the mortals who dedicate their lives to bloodshed in his name eventually become the Bloodbound. Now, Khorne Bloodbound don't quite play like the lore. Yes, they're good in a fight, but if you charge forward indiscriminately, your Bloodreavers will get picked off, your elites will get surrounded or ignored, and you'll lose. Instead, they play exactly like the army does in Age of Sigmar. Powerful infantry that marches forward in tight, disciplined formation, so that each piece works together with the others. Think of Khorne the martial scientist, master of war, not Khorne the bloodthirsty demon dog. Now, one of the main luxuries when running this warband is the access to Bloodreavers. They're sort of like a hybrid between demonettes and planesrunners. And in a game where warbands are mostly defined by what their cheapest unit can do, you're starting off in a really good place here. You also have access to two big, heavy monster units that'll strike terror in your foes. Finally, they're really durable. The only fragile unit in the warband is your cheap cannon fodder. Every other unit you can try out can take a punch. Now, one issue you are going to have when you play this warband is redundancy. Your two best units fight for the same role. You have 100 variations on semi-elite infantry, and they all move around at 4 inches. That's not to say they're exactly the same. They have differences, and you'll be rewarded if you master the moving pieces. But there are certain roles you just won't have access to, despite having a ton of cards. Then there's the mobility issue. Now, having move 5 core units means you're not completely out of luck here. But that's it. That's all you've got. None of your elites have higher than move 4. So unlike, say, Sylvaneth, which have the same issue of good move 5 chaff, but slow elites, you don't have any cheeky movement abilities to make up for it. And that segues into the last con. This won't be an issue for most people, but there's no real shenanigans in the Khorne list. It's all about just fighting really well. You're never going to do something that just feels completely broken and gobsmacking to your opponent. So let's move on to discussing the units. As always, I'll put the math hammer I use to get at the ratings down in the comments. But DE stands for damage efficiency, and tank stands for durability, and it just will let you know about how good they are per point at those two things, at doing damage and taking damage. So Bloodreavers. There's two kinds. Now, the ones with 2 little axes are always better than the ones with 1 big weapon. Even against Toughness 4, with an onslaught, they do the same amount of damage. In all other cases, the 2 little axes do more. Now, I know Bloodreavers seem unexciting. They don't have the great damage boost ability like demonettes do. They aren't quite as cheap as a planesrunner. But here's what they can do. They have respectable damage output, they have move 5, and you can get 8 of them for 520 points. That's only half your warband for 8 models. Most Warcry bands are completely defined by what their cheapest unit can do, and Bloodreavers are very flexible units. Surround and kill an important target? You got it. Bravely run away? Sure. Move 10 inches to get into an objective? Yep. So no matter what else you have going on in your warband, you have the option of a core unit that won't hold you back. Now for the most exciting unit. Iron Golems players. Look at your Ogre Breacher. Now look at me. Now look back at your Breacher. Your Breacher isn't me, but it can smell like me if you paint it red. Seriously, this is how you make a big dumb monster. Both the offensive and defensive stats are worth spending this many points on, which is something that most 200 point plus giant melee bruisers really can't say. Now, it's just big and dumb and it has move 4, so how good can it really be? Move 4 is a big drawback, but it's a bigger problem on models that can't double move without fear. But this guy has 35 hit points, so if you move it twice at the end of round 1, you can go the full 8 inches without worrying that it's just going to be exploded before it can do anything. It also has 10 damage per activation against Toughness 4, which will not only just take out a chaff unit in one round of combat, but it'll actually take out a lot of leaders in the game, which is pretty terrifying. Then its double is a sort of ranged burn spell, and it gives it a ton of utility because it can punish an enemy for trying to avoid it. Or it can serve the purpose of the Blood Warrior ability that's going to come up next, or the ability that, say, Evocators or Khorgorath Hunters have, where it frees the actual unit up for more efficient activation. Just note that it's very swingy. Sometimes it'll do nothing, sometimes it'll do 7 damage. Now there are 3 types of Blood Warriors. The Gorglaive does the most damage versus most opponents, and the 2 axes are the best versus armor. Now sometimes the 5 points saved is really useful in list building, so I tend to start with these and then upgrade if I have room in points. Just note that the Axe and Gorefist is always worse. The ability is no good here. It's the same ability that Khorgorath Hunters and Evocators have, but those units do double the damage of a Blood Warrior. So this ability just doesn't do enough damage on its own to matter, and it's normally meant to free up for more important activations on elite units, but this unit isn't elite, so it doesn't help you. The only time it could really be useful is if you have a Blood Warrior sort of babysitting a Khorgorath, but it's much harder to use that way. Now on to the Blood Warriors in general and the 2 playable versions. I go back and forth on Blood Warriors. For example, Iron Golems would love to replace their Prefect with one of these, and Stormcast would love to have this as a sort of smaller chaff unit that's still doing what they're doing. However, Blood Warriors are sort of squeezed out in this force. When every unit is a slow but semi-elite infantry, the one in the middle is going to have a tough time. It's not cheap enough to flood the board, but it's not quite impactful enough for you to want to use abilities on it when you have other options. They're the poster boys of this faction in Age of Sigmar, but in Warcry I like the other options a little better. Now we get into Skullreapers. And more than anything else, in this game, they feel like Khorne's answer to Stormcast. They're your tankiest unit by a good amount. And their damage is pretty meh, but you can use the ability to completely turn that around. Because the ability is a triple, I'm not sure I'd ever take 2. No, I'd probably never take 2. But still, 1 is very good. Just note with the ability, if the dice roll is a 1, then Onslaught is better, so there's no point ever using a wild dice upgrading 2 1s into a triple for this. Now if your dice roll is 2, this is better than Onslaught versus Toughness 4 plus units, but it's the same versus Toughness 3, so you may as well just keep your wild dice on a double if you only roll the double, and if you have a triple, that's fine. But for any 3 or higher dice roll, this is better than Onslaught, and at 5 or 6, it's insane. Also, triples in general are weirdly bad in this game. The ones that are good are usually built around combo abilities. This is one of the only sort of simple buffs at 3 that's actually solid and worth the dice. Now, Wrathmongers cost 5 more than a Skulltaker. They do less damage, but they have range 2. The issue is they also lack the triple that makes the Skulltaker so good. The quad only buffs Wrathmongers, but it does way more for the champ, because the champion deals an extra point on non-crit hits, which is what really gets helped out by that strength buff that's on the quad. They're not terrible. If you have some Wrathmongers and you want to use more than one of them, go for it. They just don't do enough damage to be the board control monster that the champion is. Range 2 is always nice, but with this low damage output, it doesn't do quite the same thing. Now, when we get to the leaders, that turns around completely. The Wrathmaster, the Wrathmonger champion, can take out a chaff unit in one shot from 2 inches away, which is incredibly valuable. If you've watched any of my videos, you know that that's what I love, is any elite that can just take out a chaff unit once. Cheap numbers rule this game, so being able to take out a cheap unit that hasn't activated yet robs your opponent of their numbers advantage. You can also park the Wrathmaster sort of near an objective, and then the next round take out 2 units the following turn, so they just can't really swarm it. Now the Wrathmaster's profile does degrade pretty heavily versus armor, so don't YOLO him into a Stormcast leader and expect him to win the duel. Also note that their faction quad ability really only works for him, but it is excellent when it does. Now the Bloodreaver Chief is also a pretty reasonable choice. At 140 points, it's by far the cheapest leader and gives you the most flexibility. He also has that extra inch of movement and a pretty good damage profile. He's very fragile, so watch out. But the fragility is still often worth it if you're just trying to do something else with your warband and you don't need your leader unit to be an important model. Now for the bad ones, the Skullseeker, which is the Skulltaker champ, costs 30 more than a Skullreaper and you get a grand total of 5 HP. That's it. No extra damage at all. It is nice that since Skullreapers are better than Wrathmongers in the units section, the Wrathmaster is better than the Skullseeker. I imagine that's not an accident. Finally, the Blood Warrior champ has the exact same stats, literally exact same stats, as a Skullreaper, but costs 20 more points. At least the Gore Fist ability, their double, has a little bit of use here. It's fine in the start collecting box if you want to use it. So I talked about most of the abilities just in the unit section because for this warband almost all of them are just straight unit buffs for one particular fighter. So are there any you actually want to build around? Well, yes, actually, there is one. The leader triple is actually good. A ton of warbands have a leader triple, but it's almost always terrible. So this is kind of nice. If your leader kills something, you can pop your triple to get +1 attack to everything within 6 inches. This can be used a bunch of ways. You can just use it simply where, let's say you have the Wrathmaster champion that can kill a lot of things in one hit, and then with 2-inch reach can usually reach something else too. You could kill something and then pop this to give it an extra attack the next time it attacks, and maybe there's something else in the neighborhood that's going to get the buff too. But to also try to build just around it to get a really huge buff with it, you can just try getting a ton of Bloodreavers into your list. You know, like I said, you could take 8 for 520 points, something like that, maybe even take 10 of them. This is always just worth it if you only just get 2 of these sort of quote-unquote onslaught attacks with it. Also, if you get a leader near a Khorgorath or maybe a really high damage ally, that can be really helpful. The Khorgorath gets a ton of benefit out of a +1 attack activation. Just be aware that Skullreapers clash with this ability. They're triple, you're not going to be able to use 2 triples in one round. So I wouldn't put a Skullreaper in your list if your goal is to really maximize Lord of Skulls. Now as far as allies go, any of the ones with movement abilities, say the Great Bray Shaman or the Chaos Lord, can really help with the move 4 problem that's sort of everywhere here. But the Bloodreavers make that less of a problem than, say, Iron Golems have with it. So in this case, the ally that I'd be most excited about would be the Exalted Deathbringer, especially the one with the spear. It gets a ton of benefit if you're using Lord of Skulls off a leader, and it also does a bunch of different interesting tag teams. So hanging out with the Khorgorath is great, because this guy's triple gives sort of a mini rampage for just one nearby unit, sort of giving it an extra move and then an attack. And the Khorgorath is the perfect target for that. So you could say have a list of a Bloodreaver Chief plus a Khorgorath plus the Exalted Deathbringer with Spear, and then just 6 Bloodreavers, and really be able to just put the Deathbringer and the Khorgorath in one deployment zone and just have them tag team and have a ton of power while all your Bloodreavers play the objectives. Now the Wrathmaster and the Bloodreaver Chief can also really combo well with it using Lord of Skulls. The Deathbringer again gets a huge benefit from it because he deals great damage but with only 3 attacks, so the 4th attack is a pretty massive 33% damage output buff. Having both as threats also means that the opponent has a harder time avoiding them. You know, they're both slow, hugely powerful, but also range 2 sort of board control monsters, this and the Wrathmaster. So having them next to each other can kind of compound the difficulty for your opponent. I might do something like a Wrathmaster, the Deathbringer, and then 9 Bloodreavers if I was going that route. So when it comes to lists, this faction has a ton of options. I must have gone through 10 lists before I decided what I wanted to showcase in this video. So with that many options, it can be really tough to collect them all easily. So let's just talk about the quickest way to get into this warband, and that's getting the Start Collecting box. It's nice because for a reasonable price you can get a pretty functional list. If you want, you can just use the Bloodreaver Chief and spam Bloodreavers, or you can build a more balanced list like this one. I badmouthed Blood Warriors a little bit earlier, but including 2 of them in your Start Collecting list lets you sprinkle at least 1 unit in each deployment zone that can't just be one-shot killed, in case you end up in a sort of hunter-killer style mission. Having a Bloodreaver as the target unit for your opponent's, let's say, Gorehound in your Khorne-on-Khorne battle is just asking for trouble. Now, also the Blood Warrior Gore Fist ability is a little bit better on the champ than it is on a regular warrior. And then, if it's an objective or a treasure mission instead of hunter-killer, that's fine, because you have 7 move 5 Bloodreavers to swarm things with. The next list is one I made trying to make sure that you could take advantage no matter what your wild dice came up with. You can use the double on the Khorgorath, the triple on the Skullreaper, plus you have the board control monster with the Wrathmaster, and enough Bloodreavers to really get onto objectives. It also makes me want to talk a little bit about the value of survivability. Defensive units in this game are generally at a disadvantage, especially when they're expensive, mainly because of the sort of activation wars that are going on, with just having lots of units being a really big advantage. However, when you take a punch and then kill the unit that punched you, or if you just kill a unit that didn't even get to activate, you're deleting activations by your opponents. The activation advantage of having a ton of units is really only a thing when your units are close to as valuable, or what you're doing with those activations is close to as valuable as what your opponents are. So most elites are not good in this game, but the ones that actually are good and are worth more than, say, 2 of an opposing chaff unit completely turn the activation wars of Warcry onto its head. This is why mid-size units like Blood Warriors aren't that great. They cost almost double what a Bloodreaver does, but their activations are not twice as valuable. Now a Wrathmaster or a Khorgorath, that's not so true anymore. They actually can just mow down Bloodreaver style units with ease. So survivability on its own is not valuable in Warcry. But with some amount of threat quality, it becomes huge, because it allows you to absorb activations from your opponents and then delete them from future turns, and make every attack that doesn't quite take down your Khorgorath or your Wrathmaster is just a wasted attack if you just kill the unit that did it and then keep marching on. This list takes advantage of that by having a survivable unit in every single zone. And it's great for hunter-killer missions because your opponent has to waste resources killing something that doesn't die easily. And all 3 of these survivable units can just turn around and explode something that failed to kill them. So yes, the Skullreaper needs help from dice to do that, but that's okay because it's the only one and it's much cheaper than the other 2. Then in case you do have to play objectives, this unit does have 2 move 5 chaff units in every single zone for objective play. Finally, we have to mess around with getting as many Khorgoraths as possible into a list, right? This way you get to run 3 of them. The Bloodreaver champion and 2 Bloodreavers. You'll just put 1 in each deployment zone and 1 Khorgorath in each deployment zone. And wherever your opponent looks, there will be a massive monster just ready to Hulk out on them. Not much to say there. You're not going to win tournaments with this list, but you are going to have a great time, and it's going to annoy the heck out of your opponents trying to take down all those corgis. So that's it for Khorne Bloodbound. If you've ever tried them out, let me know how it went in the comments down below. Don't forget to like or subscribe, because it really helps other fans of Warcry find these videos when they're looking on their little YouTube algorithms. Hope to be coming out with another one of these soon, and perhaps in the meantime we'll even find out more about Warcry Catacombs. Until then, may all your rolls be crits.